Okay. All right. Excited about today's topic. What does it mean to create a grace culture or winning in a quote unquote grace culture? Dad, I hear a lot about
Mhm.
closing culture, which is my book and everything there. I hear a lot about winning culture. I hear a lot about culture of success, all these big things. But grace culture,
Mhm.
what is that?
Yeah. Grace culture. Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, as I've had a chance to interact with different business owners and leaders, and the one thing, whether it's a nonprofit, in my case, what I have served in most primarily in a church context or in coaching, it's not necessarily nonprofit, but for those who are coaches out there, you probably feel sometimes it's nonprofit. But I think, how do you create this environment? And it's been termed, or I've termed it. I don't know if I adopted it from someone else. I heard it from. It's been so long. Sometimes you forget where it started from. But I think the environment that which brings out the best in people, and I think in understanding as those who've been created in the image of God, who have inherent value as human beings, and therefore should be treated as such. And whether you're a coach, a business owner, or middle manager, how do you create a culture where you can bring out the best in them as human beings? And I think it gets back to that. It's a Judeo-Christian term of being of grace, which is inherently being loved despite or not because of who you are, but maybe in many cases despite who you are. And what it brings out in a practical way is it removes some of the fear that most, if not all of us, deal with at some level in our lives. At some level, there's things, and I have been shocked as I've had opportunities over the years to interact with people, in some cases, literally the wealthiest people in the country, and they were part of the Forbes 100, top 100, and I've had a chance to interact with them in a relationship, friendship basis. Or whether you're somebody who's homeless, we all have these fears that drive us. Now, some would argue that even at a deeper level, there's other motivations of control and power and it's the loss of those things that the fear arises from, and so then becomes manipulative and posturing, and so knowing that we all have these internal motivations, and some of them can be counterproductive to what we're trying to do as managers or owners, is that how do we create a culture where there's more grace and those motivations are minimized, that remove the shackles or the hindrances that barnacle themselves around us as human beings, so that we are free to really bring out what we can truly contribute at the maximum level. And I think
Man.
thus doing, I think honors God that created us in His image. It's as image bearers of God, and so that's what this overall grace culture is. It's addressing some of the fear motivations that would hinder us from being who we were created to be ultimately by God.
Wow. Well, even if I can kind of picture what I feel like it might look like, but even if I don't have a clear picture yet, because I think that's something we're going to unpack today of what that would look like, it definitely sounds like something I want.
Yeah, yeah. Well, who wouldn't, right?
Right? Yeah, being valued and
Yeah,
being able to contribute and be heard, and it
yeah,
sounds awesome. So, what is a current? If we talk about what does that look like today?
yeah.
What is basically the general culture look like inside of most organizations today?
Yeah. And I think you almost have to then address the contrast, right? Is because I think most organizations, I think they do what they can on paper to truly get to what we're describing. I mean, I think, who wouldn't want that, right? In an organization. But I think at the same time, when everything comes down to push and shove and you deal with Monday morning 8 a.m., I think a lot of us are in environments where there's a fear of failure that just kind of dominates it, and as a result, often we are under people that motivate by fear. It's like, hey, unless you do this, you're going to get fired, or unless you as a coach, unless you do get that blocker, then I'm going to put my foot up your backside so it comes out your mouth. Whatever. There's much more graphic terms. There's this fear motivation that it actually works at some level. I mean, at some level, it motivates behavior, but I would submit it doesn't motivate the best out of us. It doesn't motivate the best. It's yes, there needs to be respect, and sometimes there needs to be a healthy fear instilled in that relationship with that person that we're working with. But I think overall, it's how do I cultivate that environment in a real practical way where people are free to try things and it's encouraged. And then there's a safety net. In other words, it's not like, well, go spend your entire budget for the year in January or the first fiscal month, but there's a safety net. There's accountability with that. At the same time, it communicates, hey, I value you. I believe you are important to the goal and objective of what we're after. And I'm grateful for you. So there's a gratitude that we communicate and we can verbalize and convey to people, whether written or verbal, to affirm, and even almost at times being like a mirror that mirrors back to people as image bearers of God, how they see that value. So if somebody does a good job on a sales call, or they're affirmed and saying, really what you did here was so firm. And I think we all would want that and would encourage that. But when everything starts to heat up in life and there's tension and there's stress and trying to really perform well in a very difficult situation or stressful situation, I think often we resort to the worst in us and the worst in other people. Oh, you failed here. And all we do is we point out the failure. You missed the block versus you. And then versus on the other hand to say, how could we do that differently? And then it might mean even helping people get into different places where it's not a win. It's not a successful match or niche for them. And so it means, hey, it's not working for these reasons that I've seen as we've been tracking through this for a while. So what can we do to help you get to where it's more of a match for you? And so sometimes it means we're going to move somebody out of that slot. Sure. But I think overall, that practical way of conveying grace and how we communicate and affirm, as well as the accountability that we bring.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So when I think about kind of the pendulum of, if we think of grace culture being kind of in the middle of this pendulum, on one side is this lack of confrontation. I'm not talking with anyone. We don't bring up issues. We maybe it's very fluffy and everyone's giving attaboys and backslapping for showing up and signing our name on the for showing up for the day versus real successes, and it's kind of a sweep problems under the rug culture. And then on the other side is this dog eat dog, abusive, very upfront in your face, fear of failure because everyone's kind of on each other constantly, and there's no, they're confronting, but it's over the top, it's way too blunt and it's just way too much. This kind of middle ground is what we want to strive for. I would say most companies are actually on the fluffy side, and especially leaders, they're on the side where they don't know how to bring any kind of there's zero conflict, it feels like, at all times, even though there's a lot of chaotic things going on. It's like, shouldn't we have more conflict? So what is that? Can you elaborate more, Dad, on just that current, like, what does it look like today in these organizations where they're not confronting things? Like, what does that specifically look like? And then what are some of the things that come from that kind of sweep it under the rug? Hey, everything will sort itself out type attitude inside of most organizations.
Decay and death. I think when leaders fail to address the issues that are in the organization, to address the obstacles and hindrances for growth, whether that would be identified as toxic behavior amongst one another, whether it's irresponsibility toward faithfully fulfilling their job description. I think what it creates is this decay because it's a and let me use a metaphor for me. And I've got some, health for me is really important at 60 years old and trying to stay active. At the same time, I have to be really careful with my sugars. And so if I'm ingesting and my diet consists of a lot of sugar, eventually I know that's going to really have consequences for me. And I'm fortunate enough that I immediately get headaches, and so they're pretty quickly recognized.
Fortunate.
Yeah. In that way, I know I'm not killing myself slowly. You're right. I know I'm killing myself right up front.
Yeah. The dashboard lights are going
off. Yeah, they're functioning really well, fortunately. And I think the same thing could happen in an organization when you leave things that are unaddressed. There's a toxicity that develops from either a failure to perform and almost like the complacency that becomes status quo of kind of a lukewarm kind of performance, and that anything's acceptable, or whether it's addressing specific people and the negative contribution that they bring to that organization. I think either way, as a leader, it really boils down to whether you're going to step up and be who you really need to be for the sake of that objective or that organization, whether it's parachurch or whether it's a nonprofit or whether it's a corporate entity. Is it? And I've been surprised at how many very, very successful people that I would be termed successful in terms of, if you think of just in terms of dollar salaries or the neighborhoods they live in or the cars they drive kind of thing, schools they graduated from, is how many of them have great difficulty really addressing the issues when they need to be addressed. And if you peel that back, why is that? Well, I think it really boils down to kind of the self-preservation and really kind of a selfishness that I ultimately, if you peel that down to its most basic form, is that you're not worth, or this organization is not worth, my personal unhappiness in this given moment.
Wow. Yeah. What are the consequences for that? Because a lot of people may feel like, hey, you know what? It sounds like they were successful and I hate conflict. So I don't need to address something and I can still be kind of successful. Like, is that okay? Or like, what are the consequences for not addressing things?
Yeah, I think it boils down to that whole decay and death. I mean, I think ultimately you're decaying. There's this undermining, whether it's sugar in the body that you can't see initially, maybe the difficulty, but it's creating heart disease or diabetes. Or I think in the same way in any organization, you're hindering the performance of that organization to complete its objectives. Whether, again, a nonprofit that has very specific goals that they're to achieve, is that if you're not addressing that, they're not going to achieve those goals either as quickly or as efficiently in that, or whether it's a for-profit organization where you're not hitting your marks, or even if you're hitting your marks, you could have hidden those objectives and those goals quicker and much more efficiently. And frankly, it makes for a much more happier environment as well, even though there's initial upfront pain in dealing with the confrontation, because you can't control how that person responds to you and what they're going to do. Even if they're compliant and they're a subordinate, they may not have the option of yelling in your face in opposition or rebellion, but in your own mind, they're going to talk behind your back, or you're going to, well, all that it still requires leadership. I mean, it still, bottom line, requires that as a leader, that person steps up to the plate to have those tough conversations. Again, if not, it's going to have this ongoing decay and toxicity in the organization, and then eventually even death, because you're not going to be able to achieve what you're after.
Yeah. Wow. One of the examples I think about is actually in dog training. So with a lot of people that have a dog, what they don't realize is that dog is programmed to either identify the alpha. And if they have a hard time identifying who that alpha is, they try to fill that void by becoming the alpha. And so you'll see even little tiny dogs that are really bossy and mean, and they're constantly just enforcing their own desires, whether that's to be loved and they're pushing their weight up against you and making you rub them, or you know, or whether it's even being mean and biting or snapping or whatever. All, of course, big dogs too, but the reality is that dog just wants to know who alpha is. And when you assert yourself, you look at these dogs that aren't very well trained, it's usually because that owner hasn't asserted themselves as, hey, I am the alpha. I am the one who is directing us in the direction we should go. And when they do that, that the dogs that are under those masters are the happiest dogs, because it's, you've taken all the pressure off. They're like, hey, I just get to be a dog and follow my alpha master around. I don't have to worry about making all the alpha decisions, because that's really hard for me, because I'm a dog. Like, I don't know what's going on in the
Mhm.
world. I don't even know how to open this door,
Yeah.
So the same thing inside organizations. When you do assert yourself and you show that strong leadership, the pressure is taken off of everyone else. Not making any crazy master and dog comparisons here to people, but rather that pressure of,
Mhm.
I don't need to figure it out. Michael Scott will figure out how to keep our branch from closing. I don't need to worry about that responsibility. All I need to do is handle my bookkeeping task, my lead follow up task, my whatever's right in front of me that I can control. That's all I need to really worry about. And the person who is paid the salary, who has the leadership qualities, who is put in that position to oversee this issue, they will handle it. Doesn't mean, though, that I still won't see something that they need to know about. And that's why building that culture of confrontation is so key, where there is a grace culture where we're all believing the best for each other. Because then, even with someone like myself, I can see from my viewpoint, hey, you probably can't see what I'm seeing here, because at the level that we're at, this is a huge problem. But at the level you're at, you probably wouldn't see it. You need to know about it.
Mhm.
That's what kind of helps enable that alpha, so to speak, or that manager, whoever else, to kind of take action and make that and do what they need to do. So, Dad, how do you transition to a culture of what's the future state look like? Where
Mhm.
if today looks like gossip, looks like confusion around goals, lack of accountability, what does the future state look like?
Yeah. And then how do you get there, right? How do you develop this environment of grace? I think it's important, whether you're new to an organization, like you're coming in as a leader into this organization you haven't been a part of, you've been recently maybe promoted, or you're starting a business. All those times of transition give you a unique window to implement this kind of culture in a unique way that it's harder to cultivate over time once that an alternative culture has been established. It's harder to change that alternative culture to cultivate a grace culture, a win culture when you're 20 years down the road. And so I think of an example is right from the start to seek to implement that. As I remember, as a young leader, young pastor of a church, and there was this group of people that had begun to assemble contrary to really the direction of what we were really trying to do as a leadership team and the direction of that church. And I had heard that they
Oh,
were
I was
going.
just go ahead. It sounds like you're getting into it. I was just curious what you meant by they were assembling, or what all that.
Well, they were beginning to they were gonna we were trying to have everybody gather for the direction of how to best equip and serve people that we were seeking to love and care for. There was an alternative means or methods established outside of the leadership that began to be implemented, and it had some downsides to it. I mean, it had some consequences to it, and there was some kind of weird theology that was associated with it, and there was some concern because that is something. And as I researched and some of the other leaders researched, we were clear that there was some concerns for them in that journey, and so I remember going to the meeting unannounced. I showed up and had an opportunity to have this dialogue with them, which initially was very difficult. And I did a lot of listening. In fact, I probably spoke uh, less than 5% of the time over the course of 2 hours, just trying to really listen and understand. And at the end of the time, I just really communicated very clearly to them that my concerns and that I wasn't in favor of it and why. And here is as a young new pastor of this church, what came out of it was I believe an understanding and a trust in me, even though it was difficult going into it. And in fact, I remember telling my wife, maybe you ought to stay home, honey, because this might get kind of ugly, and I didn't want her to be upset by it. And because all the emotion, and it was emotional. I mean, it was, if you would have walked in at different sections, there was a lot of emotion shared, that not by me. I was very quiet and listening, but it was just a lot of just behavior that just wouldn't reflect a lot of maturity or care or respect for one another.
Can I go just while you're in the middle of that thought? Can I go deep into something you're saying right there?
Sure.
There's something you've said about. I'm thinking about companies transition and they're executing. Here it sounds like you created a forum for conflict, right? For people to share openly and imperfectly, which is kind of where we want to dive into. And it sounds like you just listened and took it all. And so can you go deeper into that? Because I think that is probably what is the hardest transition for a lot of leaders, is basically, how do I create this forum and then not speak?
Yeah. Well,
or speak very little and listen much.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another example of God's grace in my life, because that wasn't necessarily naturally how I'm wired, but fortunately, it did actually give me credibility that I think the growth that we achieved afterwards in remaining years and subsequent years, I think that was a defining moment for me, in that where how that was handled, that I was willing to kind of ante up even and face the emotional pain that did come. And I think part of that is being in a setting where we don't have to respond to everything emotionally. And the tendency is want to control it. We want to, okay, this is not going the way I should. I'm going to control it, and I'm going to equally match the emotion of it. And next thing you know, you're in a shouting match, or who's the biggest person in the room, or the biggest bravado or whatever. And I think there's a lot to say about someone who listens and doesn't have to emotionally respond. And that was one of the cases where God's personal grace on my life was evident, because again, that's not, at that point in my life, wasn't a natural default mechanism for me. It was something that I was able to experience, and then saw the benefit of it. And it was just the importance of knowing that, hey, I don't have to react emotionally to this, and I can just listen and still make the decisions, and also know that there's no benefit in me losing control. There's no benefit of me acting out emotionally. There's no benefit in name calling. There's no benefit in
Did you come with that mindset? Like, how did you prepare yourself? You're driving to this meeting. How did you prepare yourself mentally, spiritually, all that, so that you could be as engaged and basically take these blows without throwing them back?
Prayerfully. I mean, as Josh, as I am not naturally that way. I fought my way through junior high and some early part of high school. I boxed in college. I watched way too much UFC than what is healthy for most people. And so I have this combative nature, about me, that potentially could rise. But having become a follower of Christ in college, when I was a student at Purdue, and seeing that what Christ was, that at times he did get upset. You see an example of him clearing out the temple, that he reacts to the abuse with a whip. And he reacts to the abuses of the common man who's being abused by the religious leadership, and they're being fleeced for money. And it's just a really sad situation. And you see God's anger related to that. And so it's not that I think that anger has no place, but is there a righteous anger? And that righteous anger cannot be for me and my posture, as it were. So going over there, I was just perfect because I know myself. And I had an idea based on the maturity of those that were going to be in that room, which were really young. There were a lot of young people in their journey. And I knew that it was going to be very important for me to not react. And in fact, I remember two or three of the people in that room, as the emotions were getting escalating higher and higher, and a lot of it was directed toward me, is I saw a couple of people just kind of back away from the dialogue. And interesting enough is that even though it was in a very embryonic stage, all those two or three people in that room became very significant leaders that have blessed a lot of people in their lives. But I think
did they work inside your organization after that?
Yep, they did. Wow. They hung in there. And they wound up these guys were all very, very successful in their own personal pursuits, whether in business or in academics. One of them was a doctoral student. Another one was a very, very successful broker. And I think what came out of and that person was part of that group, but wasn't at that particular meeting. It was a subsequent conversation with that individual. But I think that what I saw in there, even at a very embryonic stage, is I did not react in anger. Is I think it gained a certain credibility with them that that this guy's not going to lose it because he feels personally affronted. But it's because it's ultimately not about him. It's ultimately about much bigger objective.
Why do you feel like that's so important amongst? Because it sounds like these guys are A players, and everybody always wants to work and develop and hire and have all the A players, right? Everyone wants the best team. Why is what you just unpacked so important in developing and gaining the following of A players?
Yeah. I think, that your top talent, whatever organization, I think they look for people that will be honest with them. I remember one interaction I had with a gentleman, and who is one of these guys. The first time I met him, literally, he had told me how he had made $1 million and lost $1 million several times over. It's like, hi, how are you? I've often thought that whatever people volunteer when you first meet them tells you a lot about a person. Well, that tells you about this individual. And I remember him as I was probing in his life, and as a pastor, I came alongside him, and he was just really tough on his wife. He would humiliate her. He had some of the and publicly, and so I tried to come alongside him. He was much older than I was, and I remember as I was having this discussion, and I tried to really be very respectful as an older. He had been a president of a bank, and et cetera, et cetera. And I remember him standing up at the restaurant. This is in a public setting, cussing me out. You blankety blank, blankety blank, blank, blank. You get the picture, right? And I just sat there, and I didn't say a word. It took, after about 40 seconds of expletives, I said, "Are you done?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Can we sit down and talk?" And so he sat down. And interesting enough, he stayed with me, and that relationship was maintained. And one of the things he said to me quite a while later, he said, in the past, when I've lost it with different people in the work context or other friendships, whether in business, negotiating, whatever, he said, I've always lost that relationship. But he says, you're the first one that has hung in there with me. And what it did is it communicated a mutual respect, because I didn't react to him. I didn't get all fired up and get upset. Now, not to say that I haven't, mind you, and I've had to go back and follow up with more people than I can remember and ask forgiveness over the years. So where I have reacted and I have blown it. But I think as leaders, as we think in terms of this context and the purpose of this podcast, is that the times to which I have been quick to listen, so slow to speak, slow to anger, which is actually right from the New Testament, have played out to be very beneficial for the sake of really honoring God ultimately, and then honoring the person I'm speaking to, and then in turn seeing the objectives of that organization move ahead, whether as a small business owner in my case, or whether as a pastor.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. That's awesome. What would be some immediate steps? This has been such a great discussion. So, you know, I've just got done listening to this. I'm convinced. Okay, I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to start confronting. I'm gonna try to start addressing issues more. Where do I start? What do I do next from this? From getting excited about this to now, I need to actually think of how to implement it.
Yeah. Yeah. I would think, a couple of practical things is, one is don't take yourself so seriously. I mean, I think that maybe it starts there, is that, we all, here I'm at 60, and then I've had the privilege again to interact with people from all different spectrums over the years in all different places. One of the rooms I've stayed in the past, when I visit this individual, is I stay in the president's room because presidents have stayed in that room. So I say, jokingly to myself, it's about time I get some respect around here. And so I've interacted with people from all different walks of life, and I think that we're all basically the same. I mean, whether you're somebody that lives in a huge home, or whether you're in somebody that is homeless. And I think, one thing is just to not take ourselves as serious as that we're in the big scheme of things. It's really not about us. We're not the center of the universe. So one thing is, I think, just to give up control of trying to control people and circumstances, to recognize we're not in control. There is one ultimately, which should encourage us, who is in control, but it's not us. And so I think coming to an understanding that, what I'm really upset about, and what really keeps me up right now, and I can't seem to get out of that, this person, she said, or he said, or he did, or she did, is that, the reality is, it's in the big scheme of things. Yes, it's something that needs to be addressed, but the reality is we're not in control. And I think with an understanding of that, and then I think to look to the one who is, I think to be prayerful, to be able to ask God, to say, God, show me how to respond in a way that leads to blessing here in this situation, that leads to, which might mean confrontation. It might mean having to listen in the midst of a lot of emotion. It might mean really speaking the truth, of helping somebody be transitioned from the present role to another role, or maybe even another company or business. But I think that's going to be that port. And the other thing is self-awareness of, I think, a step of being self-aware of what is it that I fear, and what keeps me from having these conversations. Like, and if I don't do this, then where is it going to lead? This having some personal reflection. Like for me, I've been compelled to be pretty quick, and maybe some would argue too quick, to address issues wherever I've been, in whatever group or organization I've been with. But I rarely have ever looked back going, I regret not addressing that when I did. In fact, I don't know if I have. I mean, maybe I should have given it a little bit more time. If I really gave some more thought to it, I might be able to point out one or two, but not too many. I think by and large, and then coming to for me, a self-awareness to understand what keeps me from wanting to have that conversation, and then be able to at least bring it to the surface and address it. Okay, because worst case scenario, they're going to spit in my face and, and try to take me out. I don't know, probably not that. And so in the continuum, let's move backwards. If they're not going to spit in my face and try to take me out, then, okay, well then what else can I really fear here? I mean, are they going to just get upset? Are they going to quit? Well, maybe, but even then, sometimes those, lose one checker and you advance two more spaces. It's going to be more like that. So I think that self-awareness and then also I would encourage you to find mentors in your life, people that you can journey with, that have been down that road, that can help you. And I have so appreciated mentors in my life that can have been able to say, Tom, it's going to be okay. And this is expected. You're right on track, or maybe you're not on track, Tom. You need to reconsider this. And yet they've been patient with me. They haven't been motivated out of anything but a care for me and being willing to invest in my life. And I think they've applied that grace environment to me, that culture to me,
Mm,
in such a way that has allowed me in turn to hopefully extend that to others and create that same win culture.
cool. That's awesome. That's really, really good. One more step that I would add to this great list that you've already mentioned of basically meditation, reflection, basically coming in prepared is another thing you can do to really come in prepared is create a purposeful environment for confrontation where everyone knows this is a safe space, not necessarily 24/7 is a safe space, but rather there's one strategic, whether it's a weekly meeting with the right people, right, who are a part of the problem, who are in the need to know, where all of them can meet and say, hey, this whole discussion is we want to bring up every single issue that exists. We're not going to speak to the motive of the issue or the exactly dialogue too much on why it's an issue. It's just an issue, and we're going to solve it together. So if you can create that environment, which usually looks like a structured meeting, where you can just say, hey guys, the purpose of this meeting is to address issues that have arisen, that helps train the rest of the group. This is when it's appropriate. I'm going to come prepared with issues that I've been thinking about for the last 2 weeks or whatever. And then this is where I can share it openly. And then as a group, we will prioritize the list of issues we've come up with to then solve them one by one. So that
Makes
is a huge benefit. Go ahead. Yeah,
makes a lot of
please.
sense, Josh. Wait, no, I appreciate the way you said that. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense of that. And some pictures come into my mind of when you're creating that kind of environment, whether it's once a week or a different meeting, where there's freedom. And I would submit to you that takes time. Like for any organization, whether you're okay, I'm a middle management or I'm a business owner, small business owner, and I want to implement this, give yourself a lot of time to be able to create that culture where people really believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think what I've observed in different relationships is that with people that I'm working with is that they will kind of put their feet in the water, as it were, and test the temperature of how is it really comfortable? Is it really an environment where I can really feel like I can share, and so those initial attempts, and we need to be very careful not to shut those down and react in pride, in fear/pride and control, but to know that those initial attempts are being made toward what we're trying to do overall. And so not to react, but all the more patience as a leader in that organization to really extend that environment of grace, and understanding that it's gonna take a period of time into that point where you can really bring out the best, where there really are cultivating a fearless, courageous objective or workforce that's really seeking to take steps to advance the objectives of that organization.
Cool. Love it. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Dad, for unpacking what a grace culture looks like.
No, yeah, thank you. And I don't know how many people have told you you're a good looking guy, and people say we look alike, Josh. Except you've got the
Yeah.
hair. So yeah, well, thanks, Josh. Thanks for
Definitely,
inviting me.
definitely, and for those listening in audio, you can definitely tell with the laughs that I'm my dad's son for sure. So appreciate you all listening in, and look forward to talking to you in the next conversation.